Hey there guys, how are you today, and welcome to another episode of I Asked Twitter. This is the series where I ask out a question on Twitter, and based on the answers I get from all of you guys, I make a video. So, the question this week was, what is your favourite Formula 1 era? And the reason I asked this question is because, obviously last weekend we had F1 1000, the 1000th Formula 1 race. Maybe the actual race was a bit disappointing, didn't really live up to the hype. Bit of debate around that. But I thought this would be a good chance to talk about the history of Formula 1 a bit. And what is your favourite era? So let's start. So Peter says, and I love the European flag on your Twitter thing here by the way, says it's a toss between 1982 and then 2006 to 2009. So, starting with 1982, I would probably say that I believe that's the year Keke Rosberg won the Formula 1 World Championship, despite only winning one Grand Prix that season. I believe that was Monaco. And, obviously that means you had quite an interesting season with lots of different winners. And maybe even, as kind of, in a way, a surprise winner victory for the World Championship, which is quite interesting. You don't really get that now so much. I think somebody who only wins one race in a season now isn't going to win the World Championship. So for example in 2018, Ricciardo only won 2 races and he was nowhere near to winning the World Championship. But let's be honest, he was never really in contention. But maybe that's because now there were longer seasons. And I think it's hard to say that 1982 was the best era, because I think part of it has to be where you go to as many countries as possible. And then he also says 2006 to 2009, and this would possibly be up there with one of my answers, because I think 2006, 2007, 2008, 2009 were all fantastic seasons. So of course in 2006 you had a titanic battle between Alonso and Schumacher. Then in 2007, after Schumacher retired, Hamilton came into McLaren to partner Fernando Alonso, who was the world champion, and they had a great battle with Ferrari, both of them just losing out to Kimi Raikkonen. Then in 2008 Hamilton won the world championship on the final corner, the final lap of the final race. And in 2009, of course, we had Brawn GP. Moving on then to Jamie Day, who says the 2000s. And I guess the issue with the 2000s is that the first part of the 2000s weren't really as good. I would say it was a bit, the first few years of Schumacher, 2000, 2001, 2002, 2003, 2004. I think 2003 was a close season. But as far as I know, the other seasons there, it was very much Schumacher dominated. And because Ferrari are the way they are, with a 1 and number 2 driver, you didn't really even have a clear inter-team battle like maybe you've had with Red Bull, or you've had in more recent years in the Hamilton versus Rosberg era. So that'd be my issue with saying the whole of 2000s altogether. But it is true, within that decade there were some great races and some great championships. Batty Boy says the 1990s, and I think that's quite a good shout. There's lots of classic moments in the 1990s. Of course you have the start with Senna and Prost at the start of the decade, but then you move on to people like Damon Hill and Jacques Villeneuve, and of course Michael Schumacher, who really started his career in the 1990s. Of course I would say the 1990s Formula 1 decade is obviously overshadowed by Ayrton Senna's death, and also Ratzenberger, and I don't know if anyone else died earlier in the 1990s, I'm not too sure. So that's the only issue in that era, I guess. But there were certainly some great races in that era, and some great drivers who really started their careers at that time. Hakkinen as well. And then Chip says the end of the V10 era, 2003 to 2005, and the start of the V8 era, 2006, 2009, and then with 2 to 3 races as exception, every year, everything went downhill in the blown diffuser and hybrid eras. So I think 2003 was a good season. It was very close between McLaren and Ferrari, and also BMW. And then we know 2005 was very good between McLaren and Renault. Obviously the USA Grand Prix, as an exception. But 2004, it's hard to say that was a really classic season of Formula 1. I mean, the V10s did sound great though. And then as for the start of the V8 era, I've talked about all of those already, really, haven't I? And I think all of those seasons at the start of the V8 era were great. And I guess you really could extend that to 2010. But then in 2011, the run of really close seasons probably came to an end. And in this little chat here, I think we had Callan, who also said that 2010 was an amazing season too. And that's exactly what I said, isn't it? Because, of course, in 2010, you had Vettel, Webber, Hamilton, Button, and Alonso all fighting for the championship. Of course, Button was the only one in that group who wasn't in the fight in the final race in Abu Dhabi. You had some great races in that time, particularly there's a few that stand out. I think Canada was particularly good that season, and also Australia and China too. But you also had quite a few races where Red Bull simply dominated in that year. Moving on now, we're going to go to F1 in the 2000s, and he says that it's just Crystal Racing. He says 1970s and the early 1980s, there was so much competition, so many different winners, and no dominant driver at this period. And that Niki Lauda had the most wins and poles, but by a small margin. So I think 1970s, 1980s is particularly good. Personally, I love seeing the 1980s. Of course, it might have been better had they had more circuits, but that's just how it is. The sport grows over time. And in the 1970s, of course, you had Hunt versus Lauda. I think you also had to have the jeopardy of the sport being dangerous, but you did have some great rivalries. While in the 1980s, of course, you had Senna, you had Prost, you had Piquet, you had Mansell, you had all these fantastic drivers, right? Especially towards the end of the 1980s, that really probably helped make the sport what it is today. And I think it's good, exactly, you had so many great drivers, but nobody was really dominant. Although I think you'd have to say Ayrton Senna was the best. And then, who's here? James Smith says, the 1990s and the 2000s for me, but I also love the 80s too. So I don't know if the 2000s here just means 2000 to 2010. And I'd say in the time we have had some really good races. But to be honest, I think the 80s and 90s might even match it. And then we have Nicole, who has a few opinions here, which is great, by the way, guys. If you ever have more than one thing to say, please say it. So Nicole says, I don't have one, except the 50s that I don't know much about, and the 2010s, because let's be honest, with the exception of 2010 and 2012, it was pretty crap. The 60s had Clark and Lotus, and also McLaren beginning. The 70s, because Lauda and Hunt, ground effect cars, Stewart, and next week's Emerson Fittipaldi, and of course 1976. So let's take a pause there. So I think the 1950s obviously had Fangio as the main dominant driver, most famous driver from the era. And I guess the thing with the 1950s, of course, we haven't really seen many clips from it or anything. It's hard to know what the racing was really like. But what we do know is dangerous, and possibly the drivers in the 1950s, you'd have to say, are certainly braver than the ones from 2019. And then the 2010s, saying 2010s is pretty crap. I would say it is debatable, so let's go through this. 2010 and 2012 were fantastic. I would say 2011 was Vettel dominated, but if you look at it, you did have some really good races in that era. So for example, I think a couple of days ago was like the anniversary of the 2011 Chinese Grand Prix, where Hamilton on the 3-stop came back to beat Vettel on a 2-stop and made some great overtakes. So there were some good races in 2011. Of China, you had Canada, you had the European Grand Prix, you had Silverstone, which was pretty good with Alonso winning, I believe. So you did have a few good races, and also Japan as well. But we know a lot of them were very much Sebastian Vettel dominated. So it wasn't a great season, but you had 1-2 good races. I would say 2013 wasn't a terrible season for the first half. You had a few different winners, you had a few different people fighting for the win. Because you had Raikkonen and Lotus winning in Australia. But then by the time you got to the second half of the season, it went a bit downhill. Then I'd say 14, although it was Mercedes dominated, it was a good season because Hamilton and Rosberg did really go down to the wire. And in 15, it wasn't great because Hamilton really dominated. It was exciting at the start because Ferrari started to challenge them. But in the end, that season was kind of ruined by Rosberg's lack of performance. And 2016 was pretty good with Hamilton versus Rosberg. And I would say 17 and 18 were overall quite good. You did have 1 or 2 poor races, but it's ultimately about the story of the championship. And you know, it's important that when you get to the summer break, you have no idea who's going to win the championship, which team even. And 17 and 18, you could really say that. And then going into the 1970s, I would say, yeah, there were some great drivers. Of course, you had Lauda versus Hunt in 76, and in general, you had some classic good races there. And of course, you know, Stewart and Fittipaldi, all good races. And I think Stewart is really a big part of the safety regulations comes from Jackie Stewart, which I think is a big part of it. So moving on now to what else he said. He says the 1980s, because the pit stops getting a bigger role thanks to Brabham, McLaren doing so well, Mansell, Lauda, Prost, Senna, the MP4-4, which of course is a classic car, and 1982, which I guess he says deserves a mention. And I would say that is all very, very true. They're all fantastic drivers there. And in the 1990s were more Senna, Prost and Mansell, but also Hakkinen, Hill and Villeneuve. And I guess that all of these are classic drivers, probably in the top 30 Formula 1 drivers ever. Every single driver you've mentioned there. And then Nicole also says about Alesi, Berger and Coulthard. Maybe these guys weren't so good. I mean, Coulthard I think is overrated personally. And I don't really know enough about John Alesi and Berger. And then the cars looked really good. And of course, he talked about Spa 1998, which had a really good crash. A really huge crash in the first lap, which was a bit crazy. And then Donington Park 1993, of course, that was when Senna had an amazing first lap. And really OP first lap coming through the field in the wet. And then Brazil 1991, of course, Senna had his home victory that season, I believe. I believe the Formula 1 YouTube channel did a video recently showing the highlights of that race. I'm not sure if it's still up or not. And the best season of the year is 1997. And I would say that's not far off. Of course, with Villeneuve winning the championship against Schumacher in what was quite a dramatic ending. Then lastly, the 2000s with Alonso, Button, Fisichella, and of course the main man himself, Kimi Räikkönen. It's interesting, I don't think you've really actually mentioned Michael Schumacher, which is an interesting one. Is there a reason why, or did you just forget? I don't know. And the cars were good, like the MP4/20, McLaren's car from 2005, and he puts things he wants it to be in the next Formula 1 game. And he also talks about the F2007, which of course is the 2007 Ferrari, and the Williams BMW, of course, which is also a great looking car. But then also Suzuka 2005, we had Raikkonen coming through from the back. Brazil 2003 was a crazy race. We didn't really know the winner until the next Grand Prix. So many crashes in that race too. And then best season, he says 2007 is the best season of this era, and in my top 5 favourite seasons. Yeah, really long. Yeah, I mean 2007 was a fantastic season, I would say, because of Hamilton coming through. That really made a season for me anyway. And it's probably the first season I kind of started watching. And in terms of the length of this answer, you know, I should say to anyone, however long you want your answer to be on the series, please do it. It's really good to have as many opinions as possible. And next we have, who do we have? Shadow Slasher H2, who says he started watching mid-2007, so kind of like me actually. I'd probably say the 2000s just because of 2007 and 2008 title deciders. 2009 wasn't bad either, but the 2010 and 2012 races were good too. As for older eras, probably the 1970s and the 1980s, and to be honest, I would say all of that too. And then Josh Stock says the 2000s for me, mainly just because 2009, and what a season. And of course, you had Braun GP coming out of the ashes from Honda Racing, winning the championship in their first season. Of course, they did fall down a bit towards the end of their season, but you know, they won, what was it, 6 out of the first 7 races? Nobody does that now, do they? In their first season. I think that's pretty amazing. And then Rick Perry says 2014 to 2019. And I would say he maybe has a point. I'm going to talk about that more at the end, because I think I might agree with that. And then Zebby says the V6 Turbo Hybrid, that's also 2014 to 19. And he reckons, and this may be controversial, and I want to know what you guys think about this in the comments, I think they sound awesome. Better than the V8s, V10s, and V12s. Personally, I'm not too sure about that. I would say that is very much debatable. But I don't know whether the best era is necessary based on necessarily based on which engine sound the best. Next up, we have Robbie, and who says, because he only started watching Formula 1 properly in late 2012, and consistently at the start of 2014, I normally wouldn't be able to answer this. However, I thought that 2005 up to 2009 was a good era, in his opinion. And I would say that is a pretty fair comment. All of those seasons were pretty good. And then Lotus Raptors, kind of on a similar note, says, generally I look at the V10/V8 era most fondly. I would say particularly for the V8 and some seasons in the V10 era, but maybe you can't really talk about 2004 as a classic Formula 1 season. And then Kids Love F1 almost sums it up in a way. Says, in terms of driving purity, the 1950s, most dangerous eras were the 60s and 70s, so I would put the 50s in there too. Late 80s and early 90s had the best drivers. Late 90s had the close championship battles. Mid 2000s had the best looking cars, and I would say some really close championships too. And then last 10 years had great individual seasons of races. All eras were good in their own way, and that's a nice way of answering it, to be fair. Finally, and this has been a long video, hasn't it? Laurie says, the 2000s. Racing was brilliant in that era, and 2009 was the best season in this era. Whether that's true, I don't know. It's hard to say, but he reckons it's because in 2009, the top 10 was so difficult to predict. And not only that, 2009 provided fantastic races. And I would say that is all a fair comment. I'm not sure whether 2009 is as good as 2008 or 2007, but there's certainly an argument for it. So, going on to what I think, and I think all of you, in your own ways, in this I Ask Twitter, have a point. And kind of the question I want to leave it on is, so I think the 1980s and 1990s had some great drivers with Senna, Prost, Piquet, Mansell, obviously Villeneuve, Hill, all of these guys. It was all great, and some of these are some of the best drivers to ever grace the Formula 1 track and the Formula 1 paddock. However, in the time that I've been watching Formula 1 since 2007, let's make a list. In these 12 years, you'd have to say 2007 was a good championship, 2008 was a good championship, 2009, 2010, 2012, right, 2014, 2016, 17, and 18. That's 9 seasons, I believe I just named there. Were all very good championships, so it's difficult to say that this era wasn't great. Hasn't been great, even though we have had 1 or 2 poor races. And I would say, would you say that the current crop of Formula 1 drivers, say in the last 10 years, or maybe let's say since Schumacher retired the first time, so drivers we're talking about are Raikkonen, Massa, Hamilton, Button, Alonso, who else? Webber, Vettel, Verstappen, Ricciardo, all of these guys. Where would you say, and Leclerc even as well, would you say they compare at all to the great drivers I named before in the 1980s and 1990s? Because I reckon that could be the way to answer this video. Tell me what you think in the comments down below. I'll see you guys next time for another episode of I Asked Twitter.